Hello and welcome. My name is Frank Altamar, and today we're going to go through a presentation I put together on a treatise titled Infrastructural Psychosis: How Social Media Technology is Rewiring Our Brains and What We Can Do About It. So let's get into it. We're going to start today with a preface titled Psychosocial Hyperparasitism: A Social Media Model for Operant Conditioning, before moving on to the treatise itself. It's broken down into three parts. Part 1, titled Hackable Animals: Fueling Human Consciousness. The part itself is broken down into two episodes. We're going to go through episode 1 today, titled The Biological Architecture of Infrastructural Psychosis: The Prefrontal Cortex and the Amygdala, before moving on to episode 2, Sensor Saturation and Mediated Hypnosis: How High Arousal Content Drains Executive Function. And that will finish up part 1. In future episodes, we're going to move on to the rest of the treatise, but for now, we're going to go through the agenda so you can see what to look forward to in the coming days and weeks. Part 2 is titled Infrastructural Psychosis and is broken down into 5 parts. Episode 1 is titled The Death of the Shared Map: How Algorithms Fragment Reality. Episode 2, titled The Feedback Loop of the Influencing Machine: Schizotypal Delusion. Episode 3, titled Industrialization of the Anecdote: The Algorithmic Strawman. Episode 4, titled The Engine of the Collapse: Accelerationism and the Shattering of the Overton Window. And Episode 5, Postmortem of a Shared World: The Ghost in the Machine. Part 3 is the manifesto, titled The Revolutionary Psyche. Episode 1, titled Repair and Rebuild: Securing the Border of the Mind and the Two Pillars of Repair. Episode 2, The Analog Anchor: Reclaiming Your Psyche and Returning to the Real World. And Episode 3, titled The Protocol: The 30-Day Bridge Rebuilding Program. The treatise and manifesto will be followed by an afterword titled Life After the Biodigital Exploit. So the preface: Psychosocial Hyperparasitism: A Social Media Model for Operant Conditioning. So as I go through the slides, I'm going to be referencing the material and I'm going to be reading off of the slides itself. So you're going to see my eyes shifting between multiple screens as I attempt to read off the slides and engage with the camera, which is off to the side here. So just a little bit of context for the darting of the eyes. Right? So let's start with the preface. In 2012, roughly 689,000 human beings were biologically and socially manipulated in one of the largest ever social experiments in human history. Unbeknownst to them, engineers at social media giant Facebook, now known as Meta, were altering their personalized newsfeed through an algorithmic recommendation engine called EdgeRank. Dubbed the Emotional Contagion Experiment, by subtly altering their feeds to promote either positive or negative emotional content, and then measuring the resultant effect on specific EdgeRank metrics, engineers at Facebook had inadvertently posited a terrifying thesis: that the moods of their users were a programmable variable, and that they can be the programmer. In addition, subsequent releases of internal Facebook documents in 2021 confirmed the hypothesis and add that the outrage content generating negative reactions generated 18% more engagement on the platform. In essence, they inadvertently proved the age-old idiom in journalism: bad news travels fast, or in the words of Heather Hying, the emotional anecdote is always more impactful than the rational statistic. This is ground zero of what I've defined as infrastructural psychosis, an empirical model of operant conditioning in the social media sphere. It proposes that when social media companies are incentivized to promote more negative and polarizing content, they will do so. And in so doing, they are fragmenting the shared reality of their users and inducing a mediated psychosis. If psychosis is defined as a break from shared reality, and the reality is being mediated by the digital infrastructure of social media and technology, then the psychosis is not personal. It is built into the structure of our digitally mediated society. In other words, it is a feature, not a bug. When a third party can induce an emotional state of fear or anger in a user artificially By altering the content in their social media algorithms to influence those moods, they possess the tools to successfully overwhelm or bypass the critical thinking faculties in the conscious mind and defer control to a network of subconscious, hyperreactive pathways that are used in all mammals for emotional processing, referred to as the limbic system of the brain. The emotional contagion they discovered in 2018 and the subsequent reinforcement of it through their meaningful social interaction metrics is the blueprint for infrastructural psychosis. The more that we migrate to social media and integrate it into our lives, we are increasingly bringing the community of shared ideas or our shared reality into the digital sphere. Yet we are simultaneously being subjected to the most radical act of psychological warfare in human history, run by tech bros and social media conglomerates, and designed to keep the minds of their users in a hyper-suggestible state of irritability and or anxiety, where multiple conflicting narratives and hyper-real simulacra are at the same time promoted to some and obfuscated to others. This pseudo-reality generates more engagement for the purposes of maintaining ad revenue for the platforms. You have likely felt the results of this emotional contagion experiment today. If you find yourself scrolling Meta, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, any of the social media platforms. You have likely felt the phantom pull of the infinitely generating For You or recommended feeds, or the creeping desire to check your phone or for emails or notifications. Your rational mind was likely physically too exhausted from the hyperstimulation of the screens and the slot machine-like pull of the algorithms to drum up the resources to catch yourself stuck in a loop and apply the brakes. At this point, you have been co-opted. You've seen just enough in your feed that your blood pressure starts to rise and your body enters a state of tactical alertness, an ancient evolutionary response to avoid danger. While you sat motionless, your body seemingly paralyzed as you stare into the void of the screen, your mind goes to war with an invisible enemy online, mashing the dislike or frantically trying to scramble together a witty retort to make this feeling of fear or anger subside. But the algorithm is indifferent to your suffering. It only wants your attention. It thrives when you are in a state of attrition because a tired mind is a suggestible mind. When your rational brain is starving for energy and the bridge between your logical and emotional mind is severed, you are no longer a human being. You are a node in a profit-driven loop of operant conditioning. As famously quoted by visionary media theorist and philosopher Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And in addition to the social media angle, we will also focus on the technology itself, particularly the screens that are increasingly becoming the mediator for social interaction in the modern day. Whether it be conducting classes through video meeting platforms like Zoom, or relationships through social media dating apps like Tinder, humanity is increasingly embracing a transition to the digital public square, where human interaction is mediated through supercomputers designed to manipulate our most primal evolutionary heuristics. This treatise and the subsequent manifesto will define infrastructural psychosis in detail and provide you with an exit strategy. I will not appeal to your willpower, which the technology and social media machine has already effectively drained, but to your biology, primarily the connection between the neurochemistry of the brain and how we process emotions. The experiment is over. It is time to reclaim the seat of your consciousness. So, what is psychosocial hyperparasitism? I define it as a critical collective phenomenon driven by technology, consumerism, and the exploitation of human neurochemistry, leading to a pervasive and excessive demand for social engagement and validation, which ultimately saps mental resources from its users for the purposes of maintaining constant attention and engagement. So what is the framework of psychosocial hyperparasitism? Well, we'll break it down into three different parts. The brain drain, right? The mechanism. So social media platforms trigger constant microsurges of cortisol and norepinephrine, right? Defined in essence as outrage and judgment emotions, and dopamine, right? The emotion of seeking validation, right? It's the seeking emotion. The result: this saps the prefrontal cortex of the energy required for introspection and willpower, leaving the individual in a state of hypersocial reactivity. In this state, interacting with the content is not the subject of conscious attention. The social media technology has hypnotized its user and lulled them into a sense of complacency while their time and attention is being harvested for profit and engagement. Another aspect is the hypernormalization of the delusional, right? At a collective level. When technology mediates socialization, it creates a fragmented reality. Because the parameters are set by a third party without their knowledge, tens of millions of people are experiencing a social reality that is artificially curated and varies wildly from group to group and individual to individual. This is the glitch I refer to as psychosocial, becomes a collective delusion where the performance of social interaction, likes, replies, comments, outrage, and brigading, replaces any meaningful social interaction or social cohesion in a shared digital space. So, attenuation versus mirroring, right? Screen technology, right? Your phone, your tablet, right, is an attenuator of and not a mirror to modern societies, right? Whereas a mirror reflects an image exactly as it appears, an attenuator modifies its reflection based on a set of parameters. By amplifying high arousal emotions like fear, anger, and ego inflation, tech companies and social media companies, by extension, are showing us a distorted version of ourselves designed specifically to keep the cycle of engagement flowing. So, what is infrastructural psychosis? An extension of a concept found in Keller Easterling's book, Extra Statecraft: The Power of Infrastructure Space, wherein large-scale systems operate with a logic of their own that is disconnected from the physical or social reality that they inhabit. When a large-scale technology like social media is designed to deviate from reality to drive engagement, and increasingly comes to supplant all traditional forms of communication in the public domain, the schizotypal psychotic break is no longer just a symptom in the head of the mentally ill individual. It is built into the infrastructure of the modern world. If psychosis is a loss of shared reality, but the shared reality itself is being algorithmically distorted for profit or efficiency, we collectively enter a state I define as infrastructural psychosis. We are not mentally ill in the traditional sense. We have become victims of a social media campaign designed to simulate psychosis in a cynical attempt to maximize profit. So let's break down infrastructural psychosis, right? Let's start with the death of consensus reality. Typically, if you see a pink elephant standing in a room and you can confirm that no one else in the room can see it, you are likely experiencing a hallucination prompted by a malfunction in the brain, causing a neurochemical shift in one's mind, a break from the shared reality we all exist within. But if an algorithm shows a distorted political event, AI-generated video, or social media trend to a group of 10 million or more individuals while simultaneously hiding it from another 10 million or so individuals, they have created a bifurcated psychosis within the context of the event itself. What is real and what is not depends on who sees what and how it informs their experience of reality. Another aspect is the feedback loop of the influencing machine. So in early 20th century psychiatry, patients with schizophrenia often described the existence of an influencing machine, a mysterious device they believed was controlling their thoughts and body from afar. The term was coined by Viennese psychoanalyst Victor Tausk in his 1919 paper on the origin of the influencing machine in schizophrenia. The modern twist. Today, that machine isn't a delusion, it's the recommendation engine. It literally suggests what you should think next, who you should judge, and what should outrage you. Another aspect is the biological hijacking, overwhelm, and bypass. So cortisol as currency. The brain uses glucose as a primary source of fuel, and logical processes use large amounts of it. Social media algorithms prioritize content that is moral, emotional, or related to in-group, out-group conflicts, as reflected through the meaningful social interaction metrics utilized by Meta. By bombarding your senses with content of this nature, it prompts the steady release of cortisol, a stress hormone which amplifies the signal being presented and forces the brain into a state of hyperarousal, shifting the logic-based processing to reactionary emotional processing. The drain. This form of emotionally stimulating content keeps your brain in a state of sympathetic nervous system arousal, the fight or flight response. This siphons glucose from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles logic, long-term planning, and willpower, and is diverted to the reactive, hypersocial parts of your brain, particularly the limbic system and the amygdala. This situation creates a collective psychosis in the population. Participation in social media involves being subjected to a version of reality that is biologically attenuated and factually distorted from the shared reality of human experience. Its scope can widen to include the wired but tired phenomenon that defines the modern era of digitally mediated social environments, where socializing has been weaponized into a form of labor that paradoxically leaves the user feeling increasingly more isolated and socially depleted than if they were to put down the phone and venture into the physical world. By removing the concepts from more conspiratorial or esoteric framing of personal feelings and perception into a more tangible form of biological and digital parasociality, we've identified a predatory ecosystem within our environment. In this view, the social media user is the host, and the social media company is the parasite, manipulating your psyche and feeding off of your attention. When the resources of the prefrontal cortex are drained, we lose the ability to distinguish between a real social connection and a hallucinated one, attenuated by a predatory social media algorithm. We become easier to manipulate, more susceptible to rage bait, and crucially, easier to sell to. So now we move on to the treatise. Part 1. Hackable Animals, Fueling Human Consciousness. So, we're going to start with Lecture 1, Episode 1, however you want to define it, the biological architecture of infrastructural psychosis, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala. So, the biological architecture of infrastructural psychosis. To understand how you are ruled, you must understand how you are fueled. The human brain operates on a strict energy budget, and infrastructural psychosis is essentially a form of operant conditioning that reallocates that energy towards less resource-intensive cognitive functions. The CEO, the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. Located right behind your forehead, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive function, logic, long-term planning, impulse control, and most importantly, for social interactions at least, empathy. The energy tax. The PFC is metabolically expensive to operate. It requires massive amounts of glucose and oxygen to function. The weakness. Like a muscle, it becomes fatigued. The more fatigue, the more the brain relies on and switches to other regions for processing. And this is where the brain drain begins. If you think of your brain and body as a business or organization, then the prefrontal cortex is like the CEO of your brain. It is responsible for higher level function and understanding and is the primary decision maker in your life on a daily basis. The security guard, the amygdala. Deep in the temporal lobes sits the amygdala. Present in all mammals, it is the brain's emotional processing center. It doesn't think, it reacts. It scans for threats, whether real or perceived, and sends signals to various regions of the brain to coordinate behavioral and physiological responses. The efficiency. The amygdala is cheap to run. It can operate on low glucose reserves along with stress hormones like cortisol. The hostile takeover. When the prefrontal cortex is fatigued or bypassed, the amygdala, and by extension the limbic system, takes the wheel. Think of the amygdala as the head of security of your organization. It is responsible for protecting the entire organizational body, including the CEO, when under threat. When the CEO is overwhelmed by an abundance of supernormal stimuli or has been depleted through overuse, the head of security will step in as the primary decision maker, relying on learned behaviors and ancient evolutionary heuristics to function until the state at which the brain and body are at rest. So, the mediators, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the largest white matter structure in the human brain, consisting of a thick bundle of approximately 200 to 300 million nerve fibers. It serves as the primary communication bridge between the brain's left and right cerebral hemispheres, ensuring they can share information and coordinate complex tasks. The bridge. A functioning corpus callosum is what separates hallucination from reality. It gives context to our emotional responses by ensuring we balance data from our external environment with the intuition and sense-making architecture of our rational mind. Processing errors. An impaired corpus callosum is identified in patients with schizophrenia, where both hemispheres become blended and cannot perform reality testing on their environment. This explains why hallucinations and delusions are felt and experienced at an objective, observable level in affected individuals. So, apart from a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, studies have shown that chronically sleep-deprived individuals exhibit nearly the exact same impairment of the corpus callosum as those with prodromal schizophrenia, momentarily losing grip on reality until the state at which the brain and body is at rest. Another mediator is the cingulum. The cingulum is another major white matter structure of nerve fibers in the brain. It forms a near complete ring within each cerebral hemisphere, serving as a primary communication bridge for the limbic system. Its name comes from the Latin word for belt or girdle, reflecting how it encircles the corpus callosum and links emotional processing to the four major lobes of the human brain. The switch. The cingulum mediates how the limbic system interacts with the various lobes of the brain, facilitating emotional processing into various executive and non-executive functions. The disconnect. When the cingulum is experiencing fatigue, it cannot effectively switch between the logic and emotional centers of the brain, causing apathy and dulled emotional processing. Whereas the corpus callosum mediates communication between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, intuition versus reality, the cingulum mediates communication between the frontal and temporal lobes, the logic and complex emotional processing versus the reactive emotion and learned heuristic parts of the human brain. The switch, the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, is the gray matter body that forms the front part of the cingulate gyrus. It acts as the brain's integration hub, bridging the gap between emotion and cognition and evaluating effort versus reward in decision making. Conflict monitoring. The ACC detects errors in cognition and resolves signal interference, e.g., parsing between two conflicting pieces of information, also known as cognitive dissonance. The glitch. In a mediated hypersocial environment, the ACC is constantly resolving for errors because the digital world is full of contradictions, hypocrisies, and artificial threats. The result? This constant state of alarm is what many people tend to experience as anxiety. It's the brain's way of saying that something does not add up and causes it to revert to a protective fight or flight response mediated by the limbic system, making the person feel vulnerable and become defensive. The mechanism of control. By bombarding the user with high arousal stimuli, meaningful social interaction algorithms created by Meta and adopted by many others force the brain into a state of continuous partial attention. This state burns through the glucose reserves of the prefrontal cortex in mere minutes. Now, once your CEO is metabolically bankrupt, the user enters a state of defensive hypersocial reactivity. In this state, the user is no longer thinking as an individual with their own sense of autonomy. They have become a hackable animal that can be steered by fear and tribalism. This biodigital infrastructure is the first system in human history designed specifically to deplete cognitive energy reserves as quickly as possible. Every instinct to check a notification is a tiny drain on your energy, and every bit of outrage you consume is a tax on your willpower. Aimlessly scrolling is not necessarily a symptom of laziness or boredom, but a symptom of a more insidious form of cognitive hypnosis. You are scrolling because the logical center of your brain has been starved of the energy it needs to tell you to stop. You are being held in a state of infrastructural psychosis. Okay, so that's going to do it for episode 1. I encourage you to check back in the days and weeks as we go through episode 2, sensor saturation, and move through the rest of the treatise and manifesto. As I guess is obligatory, I ask you to like, comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can be made aware when these updates happen. I also encourage you to check the community tab as I have started a Patreon and a GoFundMe specifically to finance the publishing costs, to convert this treatise from a presentation into a book, and basically to get these concepts and these ideas to as many people as possible. So I do encourage you to share these concepts if they resonate with you, and I thank you for listening, for watching and participating, and hopefully we can see each other again in the future as I go through the rest of Infrastructural Psychosis, how social media is rewiring our brains and what we can do about it. Thank you for your attention, and take care.